Hello and welcome to the Reflective Practice in the Early Years webinar, a session for early childhood educators. Most of you will be well aware by now that this is one of many of the webinars that are part of the ACT's Early Childhood Education and Care Trauma-Informed Training, and that sits within the 3-year-old initiative. I hope you're feeling in a reflective mood, but if not, hopefully as we progress, you'll find yourself pondering more on the topic of reflection, reflective practice, and what you can get out of it, especially if this is new to you. So make sure you are comfortable and have a nice hot cuppa or a cool drink and maybe some nibbles. And if not, you can put me on pause while you go and get yourself sorted out, because that's the beauty of a webinar. My name's Karen Robinson and I'm going to be your friendly presenter for the next hour. So welcome on board. I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the Australian Childhood Foundation and myself, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians and the owners of this land and waters. For me today, it is the Dharawal people down here in Wollongong, New South Wales. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and the children who are their leaders of tomorrow. And we'd like to acknowledge their history and living culture and the many thousands of years in which they have raised their children to be safe and strong. So, trauma-informed practice program. Now, this session, as I mentioned earlier, forms part of the trauma-informed training for the ACT's Early Childhood Education and Care. It supports the implementation of the Quality Early Childhood Education for 3-year-olds, that initiative that I spoke about. And it's in partnership between ACT Education Directorate and Australian Childhood Foundation. There are several components to the program, so we'll keep you posted as those developments continue to happen. So what are we going to look at over the next hour when we're talking about reflecting on reflection in the early years? So we'll have a little look at what we're talking about when we mention reflection. Why should we reflect? We look at reflective practice as being a particular approach. What is it? Why is it important to us? We'll have a very quick delve into models and frameworks of reflective practice as they've been developed over the past about 100 years, and what reflective practice actually looks like in the early years setting. So a more formalized process of reflection, what we've come to think of as reflective practice, is a much more common approach within the working world these days, and certainly encouraged in many sectors, such as those under the banner of social services like early childhood education. About 100 or so years ago, it was more preferred that employees would come to work, they would follow strict processes, do their job, and not think so much outside the box. However, we know that over the last 100 years, there's been quite a radical shift towards encouraging employees to really reflect on their practice, to have a think about how they are working, how they're approaching issues at work. And like I said, particularly in the area where we work with other people. And we really want to be delving and considering, is what we're doing good practice? Is what we're doing meeting the outcomes that we want to meet? So it allows us to consider challenging issues from different perspectives by asking searching questions, but it equally may shed light on why things are working well and how we may maintain that or replicate that in other areas. It allows space to think outside the box and understand ourselves more as practitioners, encouraging continual growth. So reflective practice does require time, but if we give time over to it, it can mean greater efficiency and less burnout. And there's a little story I want to share with you that explores that concept a bit more. So bear with me while I read out a little story and come with me on the journey. So we've got two woodcutters that were in competition to see who could cut down more trees by the end of the day. And the first was an experienced woodcutter, older in years, and the second was younger, stronger man and eager to prove his ability. Both men set out to chopping. After about an hour or so, the more experienced man paused. He sat down to take a break and invited the other man to join him. Now, the younger, stronger woodcutter replied, "No way, I'm going to keep chopping and I'm going to beat you." "Suit yourself," said the experienced man. And this pattern repeated itself several times throughout the day. So every so often, the experienced man would pause his chopping to rest, while the younger, stronger woodcutter kept chopping away. At the end of the day, when the two woodcutters compared to see who had chopped more wood, the younger and stronger woodcutter was astonished to find that the older woodcutter, who had kept taking breaks, had chopped a significantly greater amount of wood. He said, "How is that even possible? You spent far less time chopping than I did. I'm stronger and I never once stopped cutting down trees. So what's your secret?" And the experienced man said, "Well, every time I sat down, I was sharpening my axe." So I guess when we are looking at our practice, maybe we can look at it in terms of it sharpening our practice. Reflective practice is really about being more efficient, getting more out of what we do. So in a really busy, fast-paced early years environment where there is a stack going on, it is really important to have some time to slow down and to reflect on what is it that we are doing? Is it efficient? Is it the right approach? Are we looking at things the way that gives us the greatest sense of direction? Are we meeting the goals that we want to meet? So what is reflection and why should we reflect? I like to think of this table as a little bit of a spectrum. So you've got reflection on one end, and that's thinking about and interpreting life experiences, beliefs, or knowledge. And you can do that on an individual basis, just in a very relaxed, informal way. As we think back and think over our lives, think back over an event that just happened and look at it and decide to ourselves what we take away from that experience, why we did what we did, why other people did what they did, just as a kind of a internal reflection, if you like. Reflexivity is more about thinking objectively about ourselves, our behaviors, values, and assumptions. So it's digging just a little bit deeper than pure reflection for its own sake. As we move a little bit further on, critical reflection is that broader contemplation to question and examine knowledge, beliefs, and actions for change. So it's giving it a very sort of specific purpose, that we want something out of the reflection. We want to look at where things may need to change. And that leads us to reflective practice. That is the use of reflective models for personal and professional growth. Now, that professional growth is quite key to us in this webinar because we want to look at it in terms of our practice as early childhood educators. We're looking at it in terms of our professional growth. And so in that spectrum, reflective practice is a more formalized approach. So if we look at reflection, we can think of it in terms of purposeful focusing on thoughts, feelings, sensations, behaviors in order to make meaning of those fragments of experience. The outcomes of this reflection is to create new understanding, which in turn may lead to increasing choices, making changes, or reducing confusion. And a lot of that does come largely through how we structure reflective practice, and we think about the types of questions that we want to ask ourselves and the group, if it's group reflection, about how we were thinking, how we were feeling, and all sorts of perspectives which will unlock a lot more meaning than if we just look at it from our own angle. A very famous man by the name of Albus Dumbledore said, "One simply siphons the excess thoughts from one's mind, pours them into a basin and examines them at one's leisure. It becomes easier to spot patterns and links, you understand, when they are in this form." And I guess we can liken reflective practice to being that bowl where we siphon out all of our thoughts, what happened, and examine them so that we can actually spot certain patterns in our thoughts, our behaviors, our feelings, and make linkages through understanding more about our values and so forth. A very wise man, Dumbledore. So then what is reflective practice? It is an ongoing dynamic process of thinking honestly, deeply, and critically about all aspects of professional practice with our young children. Now, while it can occur spontaneously, reflective practice that we're talking about today is more often than not a formal process. However, being involved in a formal process of reflective practice actually encourages a lot more spontaneous reflection as well during our work days, because we know that at some point in time we're going to come together as a group, or perhaps with another practitioner who's leading our reflective practice, and ask questions of us and ask us to delve more deeply into it. So it does actually encourage us to be more reflective during our working day. Most importantly, it will lead us to action. So reflective practice will start to ask us to think about where to from here. If we have identified certain patterns, we've identified links, we've identified perhaps where there can be hiccups, glitches, more efficient ways of doing things. We seek outcomes to improve. Although we also can identify areas that are going really well, and we might seek to replicate those across our working environment as well. Which leads us to one of the aspects of reflection, and that it is the process of shaking up assumptions in order to deliberately surface those that may be hidden for a variety of reasons. There needs to be a degree of discomfort or unease in order to motivate learning. And that's an interesting concept. Now, we don't want to say that reflective practice, you have to be feeling a degree of discomfort or unease, or else you're not really reflecting. But it certainly is an aspect that may come up in reflective practice, because we are diving deep. We are having to look at what is driving us, why we look at things the way that we do. And that can be a little bit uncomfortable, especially when we're in a group and we're diving into these things more deeply. However, in doing that, and if we have the space and support to be able to do that in a safe environment and a supportive environment, then we're looking at opportunities for personal professional growth. And they actually happen within that area of being able to let go of ego, to be able to be more open. And certainly sitting in uncertainty is an area of growth that reflective practice can really encourage. You don't have to know the answer. One of the most important things about reflective practice is to be able to just sit in that uncertainty and ask questions so that we can explore further. So uncertainty is actually a great starting point for reflective practice. We want to be curious. We really want to look at things and go, why are they the way they are? What am I doing about that? Why do I think that? And it does mean then that we need to be brave. We need to have a bit of bravery to be able to explore these things in their entirety. It does mean that we want to be questioning. Questioning is a core element of reflective practice, picking out questions that are really going to get to the source of the issue that we're looking at. We want to be observant, and reflective practice does encourage us to move about our work environment with more observation. It also encourages us to be more adaptive. So we need to be able to adapt to different people's perspectives, different values, different ways of looking at things, and be able to respond to that new understanding. It requires active engagement. We need to be able to fully embrace reflective practice and fully engage with it if it's to be useful. And it is definitely journey orientated. It really is about the journey and not the destination. Reflective practice is all about looking at how we are tracking, how we are traveling, how we can constantly improve on our work practices, particularly in a trauma-informed framework. So why should we reflect? Well, we've touched on a lot of reasons behind that, but it is about recognizing and continuing good practice. We want to obviously maintain any practice which is considered to be good practice. It is reaching our goals. It is supporting our ethics. And certainly for ACT early childhood workers, it's also acknowledging the framework that is supporting the work that you do. Change and improve what is not working well. So obviously, reflective practice is all about also acknowledging those things that aren't working the way that we would hope, that we might be stuck professionally. We might have a problem in our centre and be finding it really difficult to be able to change. And so reflective practice is about pulling those things apart and looking at how we can improve them. It does challenge practice that are taken for granted. We may have initially thought that one approach was the best. It may have worked for a while, but we also want to stay up with the way that things do change over time. So it keeps us more current. It keeps us on our toes and changing with the way that the world also changes. And we know that various things will morph and change over time, and it will create challenges that may not have existed 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So as we face new changes and as we face new dynamics, reflective practice allows us to continually face those and have a look at those things on a more current basis, if you like. Reflective practice also allows us to monitor and review all aspects of practice on an ongoing basis. And that goes back to that being journey orientated rather than destination orientated. Reflective practice is not about reaching a particular destination. It is very much about an ongoing journey of reflecting, putting things into practice, reflecting more on how that looks, and so forth. We want to recognise when to find more information or support from others. Reflective practice makes us think outside our own perspective and say to ourselves, do we need support from others? Do we know everything that we need to know in order to look at this challenge or this issue from all the angles that need to be looked at? Is there something missing in our understanding? And who can we go to create more understanding, broader understanding, or more in-depth understanding? Many of the challenges for educators in early childhood settings, particularly with children who have experienced trauma, gravitate around that context of uncertainty, the unpredictability and the complexity of our early childhood environments. When we think about the amount of changes and transitions that go on, we think about all the different activities, the different spaces within your centres. We think about all the people that might be coming and going during an average day. We think about the high risk and challenging traumatized families that we are coming into contact with and what that throws up, how we engage with them. What does the child need from us? What does the family need from us to be able to really engage with our service and to be able to meet the needs of the child? We also have to be accountable and effective in that space of uncertainty. And that does create a challenge for us. And it certainly throws up a lot of ethical dilemmas. Those dilemmas where there are no clear answers, and each answer that we come up with, each solution, may also come with its own problems. There are obviously going to be more challenges, and one of those things might be even just finding the time to weave in reflective practice. One of the challenges is certainly what we call single loop learning. Now, if you look at this flowchart as an example of what can happen with single loop learning, we can look at the espoused theory up the top there. Parents should be part of the decision-making process, and that's a fairly standard theory for a lot of people working with families. There is a theory in use that parents can be unreasonable and difficult to work with. We acknowledge that especially families that have experienced trauma, are very traumatized themselves, can find it very difficult to engage with us in ways that facilitate engagement, collaboration. Now, because we may hold that within ourselves, we may unintentionally or even intentionally minimize parental involvement because we hold that theory in use of parents being possibly quite difficult to work with. And the consequence of that can be that parents become more angry and frustrated, which then for ourselves proves, it affirms our theory in use that parental anger is seen as a confirmation of their inability to hold balanced views about their needs. So because that proves to us that theory in use of parents being unreasonable and difficult to work with, we go back to the loop, back to the strategy of minimizing parental involvement. And we may do that by making some attempts to create space for parental involvement, but create it in a way that has limitations, where we know that perhaps those most difficult families to reach, where we're finding a lot of conflict or misunderstanding, we know that they are less likely to engage, and therefore our systems may involve some parental involvement opportunities, but have limitations that mean that really effective, genuine engagement with parents is very limited. And those parents that are seemingly locked out remain angry and frustrated. When we look at double loop learning, we look at the parents who are angry and frustrated, and we see that as a reasonable reaction to being continually sidelined, or that we're not digging deep enough to really find effective ways of engaging with them. So then we look at attempts to work with those parents in a more inclusive and creative way. And that allows change in that theory in use, how we actually put theory into use. And we can do that through reflective practice. So we are hoping that reflective practice creates higher quality practice and better outcomes for children and families. So you can see that in that single loop as compared to the double loop learning, that if you are doing reflective practice and you are encouraging that double loop learning, you are more likely to have higher quality practice and better outcomes for children and families, because you are really trying to dig deep and look very carefully at what is obstructing, for instance, in that example, parents' engagement, and really trying to find ways to overcome that, even though we acknowledge that it can be really challenging. It also helps to increase the capacity of staff to think from multiple perspectives and keep in mind multiple versions of the truth. And we can easily forget that because we move in a world where we've obviously got our own lens on, which is based on our own values and our own perspectives and morals, our upbringing and so forth. But in reflective practice, it actually exposes us to other people's way of viewing things, other people's values, ethics, and their truth. And that is why it can be challenging to us. It can create discomfort because it's quite confronting at times. But allowing the capacity to grow and thinking about other people's perspectives can be really foundational in creating that best practice. It can expose staff to differences and thus increase your tolerance to different perspectives, understanding, cultural knowledge, and ways of being. And once we're exposed to this and we're able to talk about it and see why things are the way they are, why people hold different perspectives, why people approach things in different ways, it allows us to create more tolerance within ourselves for difference, because we actually start to understand it. And therefore, it is seen as less threatening. It raises our awareness of values and beliefs, both within ourselves and within other people. We're more likely to challenge and change practice. We're more likely to be more responsive to the way that our work environments change and the new challenges that may come up in it. It leads to inclusive environments and promotes collaboration, because we are keen to find out how other people are seeing the same issue or the same challenge and really share those thoughts and ideas. And it encourages seeking research, resources, and advice. So we need to talk to each other and say, are we missing anything? Are we missing a key understanding here? Where can we go to find out more? Who can we talk to find out more? And those actions can be really illuminating. We can work out why something may not be working currently. We can work out why something is working and do more of it. So reflective practice gives you a deeper understanding of why things happen. A few years ago, our reflections amounted to reflecting on the day. Was it successful? What might we do next? Now it's much deeper and focused on what each of us did and didn't do and how that contributed to outcomes for children. And that can be really confronting. That's a lovely quote from a teacher that delved further into the reflective practice. And that's the key point there, is that it is deepening understanding of why things happen and reaching much more further into practice. And it can at times be confronting because of that very reason. So holding that in our minds, we acknowledge that there are barriers to reflective practice, and partly acknowledging some of those barriers, we can be more aware of them. So practical barriers include things like time constraints, busyness, stress, workloads, and commitments, which I'm sure we're all well familiar with. And the environment that you work in, as I suggested earlier, I understand how truly busy and chaotic it sometimes can get in an early childhood centre. So it's very difficult to be able to just stop and pause and be reflective. There can be psychological barriers, so fear of judgment or criticism. There can be defensiveness, professional arrogance, anxiety, or shame. So you really need a supportive environment so that you are all able to put out suggestions and be honest and support each other. Because without safety in the environment, it can be very difficult to be very honest, open, and upfront. It can be difficult to put new ideas, to think outside the box, if you fear that there will be judgment or criticism. There can also be organisational barriers, organisational culture, for instance, workloads, and waning commitment from both management or staff towards reflective practice. It really is something that is most successful when it is woven into the working structure, whether that's meeting on a fortnightly basis and having it specifically tied into the schedule. There can also be personal barriers, so lack of skills and understanding of reflective practice, which hopefully after this webinar at least allows you to address some of that. If you had little knowledge of what reflective practice actually was, then you might have been able to build on that understanding about what it is about and why it's really useful. When we think about integrating reflective practice into the workplace, it can look in many different ways, such as specific group reflective practice, having time to come together as a group in a formal way. It may also include reflective individual supervision, or it could be reflective journals, case notes, meetings, mentors, professional learning experiences, and reading, research, and professional development. And all of those things can embed reflective practice. So where did reflective practice come from? What are its roots? There are a number of models that are the basis to what we know of today as reflective practice. We're only going to very briefly delve into one of the models today, the philosophical underpinning, which is Dewey's model of reflective learning. And we're going to have a very quick look at some of the frameworks that have been developed to guide us in a more formal reflective practice. So Dewey's model of reflective learning, he's thought to be the founder of reflection as it relates to personal learning. He suggested that reflection for learning should include recalling the event and then posing questions to explore why things turned out the way they did and what possible actions could have given a different outcome. So in 1933, he made the distinction between routine action, so action driven by habit and routine, and reflective action, which is action given careful consideration and justification. And he cites that frequently in the literature. So he's attributed to having extended the notion of reflection as being critical to the development of professional practice. He's like a godfather of reflective practice today. So we learn by doing and realizing what came of what we did. Experience, observation, reflection, and that gives us knowledge. Now, he makes up the foundations of reflective practice. What does that actually look like when we are practicing reflective practice? So what you'll notice from some of the models that we're going to have a very quick look at is that they largely combine those foundations that Dewey was talking about, where we look at what happened, we analyze it, and then we look at where to from here. So Gibbs' reflective cycle, which was developed by Graham Gibbs back in 1988, gave structure to learning from experiences. And it offers a framework for examining experiences, and given its cyclic nature, leads itself particularly well to repeated experiences, allowing you to learn and plan from things that either went well or didn't go so well. So there are 6 stages, as you can see. You look at describing what happened, you look at describing how you were feeling and what you were thinking, you evaluate what was good and bad about that experience, you analyze what you can make out of that situation, you can make conclusions about what else you could have done, and then you put that into practice. And then you go back to that description of what happens next in that next experience. And you keep cycling around that. There's also Kolb's cycle of experiential learning, which again, you'll notice all of these are very cyclical, but this drops back down to 4 main parts. Now, the Kolb learning model describes learning as a never-ending cycle comprising of 4 stages, and it shows how experience is translated through reflection into concepts, which in turn are used as guides for active experimentation and new experiences. And they follow on from each other. So while the cycle may be entered at any point, the stages should be followed in sequence. So you've got the learning cycle, which provides feedback, which is the basis for new action and evaluation of consequences of that action. So as learners, ideally go through the cycle several times, and it may be thought of as a spiral of cycles. Rolf minimizes it even further into just 3 separate areas. What happened, so what, as in what did this mean to you, why is it important, and now what are you going to do with this knowledge? Now, with the what, the kinds of questions that you may look at are what happened, what did you observe, what was my role in the situation, what was I trying to achieve? So those are the kinds of questions that may fall under the what category. The so what might be things like, so what new skill did you learn? What surprised you? So what does this tell me? What does this teach me? So what did I base my actions on? Those kinds of questions to explore what happened deeper and further, which leads us to the now what. So now what do I need to do in order to make things better? Or now what might be the consequences of this action? Or even now what learning occurred for you in this experience. So you can see that the questions that we put into the reflective practice are a really important aspect. The questions themselves need to be quality, because they're the things that really help us to dive deep and explore areas that we may not have considered before. So what does reflective practice look like in the early years setting? So supporting for the holding children together approach. Reflective practice model aims to create a learning environment for staff which they can access and actively participate in routinely at work. It mirrors the relational emphasis of the ACT and the National Early Years Learning Framework. So you will find that some of the principles are very relevant to the reflective practice. And in fact, Principle 5 mentions reflective practice. It is to consolidate the implementation of trauma-responsive practice in early years settings across the ACT. There will be other aims that you might be able to get from reflective practice beyond these umbrella aims. And that is something that you and your colleagues can really have a think about. What do you want to get out of your reflective practice? Because it is for you, after all, to help you grow professionally, to help the life of the centre be one in which it is meeting the needs of the children, the families, but also the staff, so that you as staff members enjoy the environment that you're working in, you feel supportive, and you feel like you're on the right track. How it may actually look in terms of the kind of reflective practice that you will be involved in is undecided just at this particular time as I'm standing here recording the webinar. But for your own information, there are two different types of reflective practice in a formal sense, and that is reflecting as a group and reflecting as an individual. I've just noticed that it says reflectioning. Isn't that terrible? So reflective practice as a group could look at a reoccurring concern that staff have within their centre, or an area which they want to develop their practice in, or even concerns around a specific child who seems to be struggling in the centre environment. And that certainly lends itself to children in particular who are struggling perhaps with the impacts of trauma, where their protective behaviours may be creating problems for staff, and the staff may be trying to work out what is the best way of supporting this child. How do we cope with and how do we support this child when those protective factors kick in? Now, usually in a group reflective practice model, a manager or another nominated key person helps to facilitate that process. So they're the ones that are going to be asking probing questions, which are going to encourage the group to think outside their own framework or perspective, to dig deeper into exploring the concern or the topic, to challenge viewpoints and assumptions, to lead the group into formulating new perspectives. So understanding and all of the wealth of new knowledge that can come from exchanging ideas and being asked really searching questions. And then it helps the person that's leading on it helps to consider possible ways forward, the kind of next steps, if you like. So as a group, you might reflect on what's come out of those questions being asked, and what does that actually mean for moving forward as a group? What kind of actions might we put in place given what's come out of the reflective practice? Do we need to go and approach other people for more information or advice and guidance? Do we need to change certain routines? Or do we need to introduce something that we hadn't been doing previously? As a looping process, the group would likely revisit this concern or topic to reflect on whether the things that have been that have progressed in a way that has been beneficial to those involved, in particular the children, especially in the light of Early Years Learning Framework for Australia. So reflective practice means that you will come back and reflect on any of those changes that you have implemented further down the track, to look at and say, is this what we were hoping for? Is it working? Do we need to tweak it further? So again, it reflects that circular or spiral understanding of reflective practice. We have an event, we look at it, we think about it, we ask questions of it, we then say, what do we need to do from that? We might put things in place, and then we go back and say, right, well, now that those things are in place, now that we've made these changes or undertaken these actions, what then? What is the experience that we're having now? And ask those probing questions again. The other form is that individual reflection. So you, along with a supervisor, it might be an external supervisor, would go through a similar process, but obviously it's just you and that other person, and they would ask you probing questions as well to really explore maybe something that you are stuck on, something that is coming up for you that you're really struggling with, or an aspect of your work that is going really well, to really reflect on what is it about that is going so well, and how can you maintain that. So what does this mean for your teaching and your site? We want to think about how this may be implemented, and you will be told later on what that's actually going to look like for your centres, what kind of format it's going to take. But at least now you can look at it and know what the process is generally going to look like, why reflective practice should be seen as a really positive element in any professional's work, particularly in the area that we work in, when we're working with children and families, and also obviously for those that are experiencing trauma. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the series of webinars and that you get a lot out of those. My name's Karen Robinson. Thank you for joining, and I hope you have a good day.